Thank you. I'm going to tell you another version of the Cinderella story about how beautiful Matera, which Pietro Laureano introduced you to, came to be transformed physically as well as transformed in the collective Italian mind from, get the hang of this, an abandoned and dilapidated junk heap, which is what I first found when I went there 25 years ago, to the jewel that it is today with all its coveted international titles of cultural greatness and its elegance and refinement. But before getting into this fable, I'd first like to describe by way of context how Italy came to respect and conserve its vernacular and non-monumental architecture, namely its village architecture, like the historic urban fabric of Siena, seen here, and the celebrated villages of Cinque Terre. Italy, like China, has a great wealth of architecture and other material cultural remains that have built up over millennia. Layer upon layer of past civilizations and cultures are woven into Italy's picturesque landscapes and dense urban settings. Even though Italy has experienced periods of great destruction of historic building fabric for the sake of modernization, such as under Mussolini's fascist reign, and here you see a picture in Rome of where Mussolini was tearing out ancient ruins to carve a road between his office and the Colosseum. In the big picture, Italian's culture's overall conservatism, its ingrained humanism, and its civic orientation have created a historical consciousness that sets it apart. This prudent attitude has placed Italy in the forefront of architectural conservation. Not only has Italy been preserving and protecting its legion monuments for centuries, but it's also been a torchbearer for preserving humble architecture, including vernacular architecture, village architecture. As pictured here, this was advice that Alberti gave in the 15th century on how to restore a building. The catch-all term in Italian for non-monumental architecture is minor architecture. This includes rural and vernacular structures, as well as the non-monumental and even industrial constructions that comprise the urban fabric. Roberto Pane, a celebrated architectural historian, sums it up like this: if monuments are the poetry of architecture, borrowing a term from John Ruskin, then minor architecture is the literature of architecture. I hope you're enjoying my attempt to translate into Chinese. It's thanks to Google Translate. Who knows how accurate it is, but maybe it will be entertaining. The modern preservation movement in Italy has experienced three moments of increased interest and awareness. The first accompanied unification of the nation in the 1860s and 70s, when the conservation movement formalized with the passage of numerous laws to protect monuments, archaeological sites, and works of art. And here you see one of the doors into, one of the gates into the city of Milan that was restored in the 1850s by an early modern preservationist, Camillo Boito. The concept of protecting humble, non-monumental architecture marks the second wave of interest in preservation in Italy, which crystallized in the 1920s and 30s during, or rather in reaction to the fascist regime's mass destruction of historic neighborhoods surrounding monuments. And here we see before and after shots, again in Rome, of a neighborhood that was destroyed during the fascist regime, a neighborhood of ancient structures. Mussolini, mind you, was a proponent of preserving and restoring monuments, namely classical and medieval monuments, civic architecture that fed his image of grandeur and authority through association with past power. However, he had no respect for what he called the mediocre construction that disfigures monuments. In other words, the urban encroachments surrounding them. His urban renewal policy, which was aptly called sventramenti, or disemboweling, involved liberating, again his term, the ancient monuments by tearing out the structures surrounding them. In his own words, "The millennial monuments of our history must loom gigantic in their necessary solitude." The concept of valuing historic neighborhoods as part of monuments took form in the 1920s in several Tuscan cities that, ironically, were used to actually construct the fascist narrative of historical continuity with the medieval past. One of these was San Gimignano, which in 1928 was the first whole city designated as a historic monument in Italy. And about the same year, Arezzo restored an entire urban neighborhood, a medieval neighborhood. And here on the upper left, you see Arezzo being restored, this neighborhood, and then this is beautiful San Gimignano. This progressive idea was formalized by Gustavo Giovannoni in the 1930s. He writes, "The city, the village, the neighborhood, the piazza, the garden, the street are all considered works of art as living organisms and all elements of a single structure." His writings entered a turbulent debate that was taking place between proponents of modernization through radical change to older cities and those who wanted to save all extant buildings as an antidote to Mussolini's harsh gutting of cities. Giovannoni's middle-of-the-road perspective mediated between this polemic, between the two sides, and he said that old cities are not at odds with modern life. They can support moderate change through, in his words, rational study and action, applying logical and living solutions to such modern needs as increased traffic patterns and urban hygiene. His book, Old Cities and New Constructions, advocates making minor changes to the historic fabric by thinning, repairing, and updating existing historic urban fabric with microsurgery interventions instead of the macrosurgery gutting of cities that the fascist government was carrying out. He also presented the idea that a monument's dignity and its scale depend upon and the coexistence of the more modest buildings surrounding it, so that the older parts of a city merit preservation because they are physical manifestations of culture and society. In 1931, he presented these ideas at the first International Congress of Architects and Technicians of Historic Monuments. It's a mouthful, but basically that's the predecessor to UNESCO. But these revolutionary ideas he was having, or these progressive ideas, were not included in the resolutions that came out of that conference called the Athens Charter. It took 30 more years, the destruction wrought by World War II, and the establishment of UNESCO, ICOM, and ICROM before Giovannoni's ideas were incorporated into international preservation policy, namely the 1963 Venice Charter, which still, of course, guides the field of preservation today. And just to remind you all, I'm sure you've all read it, but Article 1 of the Venice Charter states, it comes directly from Giovannoni, the concept of a historic monument embraces not only the single architectural work, but also the urban and rural setting. This applies not only to great works of art, but also to more modest works of the past, which have acquired cultural significance with the passing of time. And in the past 50 years, this definition has continued to broaden to include surrounding landscapes, cultural diversity, and intangible as well as tangible heritage. Giovannoni's ideas continued to develop in Italy through a discourse on historic city centers, which began in the 1960s with the Gubbio Charter, and basically continues today. The questions are what to do with urban cores, how to deal with, at the time it was in reaction to World War II, and the Western world's awakening to the failures of early modernism with such vitriolic critiques as Henri Lefebvre and Jane Jacobs. This new appreciation for and valorization of historic urban cores was born, signaling Italy's third chapter in modern historic preservation. Distinguishing this moment from the past and further removing the Italian field of preservation from its academic and curatorial origins was an economic discussion of the financial benefits of preservation through transforming obsolescent buildings into cultural and economic resources. Marking the Italian urban theorists' approach to preservation was their goal of protecting civic life, so valued in Italian culture, from the destructive threat of urban renewal. The historic city center discourse in Italy expanded through the 1970s with the question of what functions to give historic urban centers, how to incorporate them into the rapidly expanding, decentralizing cities, how to turn historic buildings into economic resources with renewed use values, how to integrate them physically, socially, and functionally into modern cities. Making this distinction between monumental and minor architecture, but realizing their interdependence, official Italian preservation policies and practices, which have now been developing for 100 years, transcend this high-low division of architecture and guide the nation with an inclusive approach to historic preservation. This is reflected in Italy's many conserved cities and villages that are also still vibrant communities fostering civic activity and cultural richness, following the philosophy of Giovannoni. At least in many cases, these communities attempt to integrate modern needs and technologies with their historic fabric. I have a picture on the left of a house, an ancient house in the Sassi with satellite dishes. And on the right, you see Pietro Lariani in the same hammam that he showed you earlier, where he's brought not only water in, but then he's transformed this a former cistern into a hammam. When successful, they achieved that holy grail of authenticity that's sought by tourists. Vibrant living cultures set within historic architecture that nevertheless responds to contemporary lifestyles and accommodates tourists without being given over to tourism entirely. Due to demographic exodus, industrialized farming, a lack of jobs, landslides, earthquakes, various things that have pushed people out of cities or towns. This, for example, is a former town called Cracco, which is near Matera, and it's what Matera used to look like. The success story of Matera is situated in this context, which is why it's so interesting and why Matera breaks the mold. So here are the cities that I was just talking about, and I've been talking about so far. They're all in the north. And then here's Matera way down here in southern Italy. Also significant to the story is the vernacular architectural form that Pietro Laureano told you about, which is the cave house, which is essentially the yaodong that you have here in China. The Matera was built on a ravine, and most of the dwellings have a cave component. And here, this is all caves, all in here. These are all cave structures, all along here. Many people actually wanted to bury and obliterate the caves in Matera's history. They wanted to bury this history because of the shame that Pietro told us about. So the fact that Matera's had this comeback is all the more remarkable. For thousands of years, through the 1940s, the majority of Materan citizens lived in these cave sectors, these called the Sassi. And as you've seen, they're a combination of cave and constructed house. And there are simple houses, there are palaces, there are churches, there are workshops, were stores. It was the whole city. In the late 18th, 17th, and 18th centuries, however, the rich moved out of the caves and moved up onto the top of the hill. And the people living in the caves that were left were the poorer people and the farmers, which is what most people were. So there was a concentration of poorer people and people with a traditional lifestyle, the traditional farming lifestyle, who remained in the caves, and the wealthier moved up to this to the plain above the caves. And as a result, there was a concentration of people with a traditional lifestyle in the caves over the years. But even though their lifestyle remained the same, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the modern times decided that that wasn't an acceptable way to live anymore. And Matera was criticized for not changing with the times and for having a pre-modern lifestyle, even though they weren't the ones changing. It was social acceptance that changed. The higher the bar rose, defining what was acceptable, the farther down Matera fell in the public's mind. And due to a constellation of national politics and publicity taking place in the mid-20th century, Matera's caves became known as the national shame, as you've heard. I can't say enough how important it was to the city that this shame was placed on it. The residents, the city, and the Sasi were publicly disparaged for their pre-modern lifestyles. And what people were most upset about was an issue of hygiene and the fact that people's barns were incorporated into their houses. So here you can see there's a mule in the back of the house in the barn area, and here is a chicken here. And this is just a typical house. But this was the lifestyle, and this was acceptable until the 19th and 20th centuries. The scorn continued to mount. The city continued to be ostracized for its lifestyle. And finally, after World War II, the government said, you know, we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to move the population to a new city. And so they built, here's a new city that was built. Here's the city that was left behind, the historic city. So in the name of improved hygiene, in the name of modernization, Matera was abandoned. The old city was abandoned. So this led then to structural collapse because, as Pietro was telling us, you're not living in the place, you're not maintaining it, it starts to collapse. And then there happened to be some earthquakes in the night about this time too, which helped move things along. So the situation was getting pretty bad. And the intelligentsia, though, of the new city, but you know, people who are culturally continuous with Matera, they started sort of petitioning the government to do something about this. They recognized that the Sasi had great value artistically, historically, culturally. And so through their influence, there was a law passed in 1967 that recognized the caves as a zone of historical, archaeological, artistic, scenic, and ethnographic interest. So it officially changed the title from shame to monumentality, but it didn't have any effect because public perception was still that the site was shamed. So nothing changed, even though the law was changed, recognizing its value. So the government kept building new habitations, kept moving people out. This went on for 25 years. 20,000 people were moved out. Almost everybody. There were a few people left when the government finally said, basta, we're not going to pay for any more new dwellings. So then about 10 years of discussion takes place when the Sasi keep getting more and more dilapidated, collapsing more and more, and it's stuck in a debate, mostly happening in Matera, a debate about what to do with the Sasi. So you had two main opinions. One was of the people who had been moved out, who thought that it should stay empty. They wanted it to be a monument to their suffering. They did not want it inhabited and lived in. And then you had the sort of cultural elite of the city, this intelligentsia that really wasn't from the caves, that recognized the value of the caves. And they thought that they should be inhabited, updated to modern living standards, but inhabited because they felt that it was a work of art and that it was cultural continuity for it to be inhabited. So this debate went on for quite, as I said, at least, well, formally 10 years, but really it went on for decades. Where the former Sasi residents wanted it to be they would say, the Roman Forum of peasant civilization, while the intelligentsia would say that that was turning it into a dead city, a Pompeii, and they didn't want that. So what they started to do is change the narrative that Pietro was telling you about. He said that every site needs a narrative. So they started to change the narrative from a story of poor hygiene and suffering to a story of art and beauty and culture that recognized the cultural value of the city. So the politicians then had to get into the discussion, and they took the side of the former residents, and they said no amount of technology can ever make the Sassi livable again. So finally, in the 1970s, the architectural community got into the discussion, and there was an international design competition for what to do, some new ideas for how to reuse the Sassi. In fact, if I'm not wrong, Pietro Laureano was a contestant in this, and his proposal came in 7th place. In fact, there wasn't a winner. They didn't give a winner, but this number 2 place was the de facto winner. And that, I wanted to tell you the range of solutions. One was to turn the Sassi into a mushroom farming facility. And then the other sort of end of the range was to make it purely a site of tourism. But the project that actually won, or won 2nd place, de facto winner, wanted to kind of follow this idea of the historic center discussion that had been happening in Italy for a while. They wanted to physically, socially, and economically integrate the Sassi into the modern city. That sounds kind of obvious now, but it was not obvious at the time. And tourism was not actually part of their plan. I think they thought that it might have tourism, but it was not about tourism. It was about bringing the city back to life. But the difference is they wanted middle-class people to live in the Sassi, not the poorer people, not the farmers who had been evicted. It was a change. They wanted to make it a middle-class place to live. These are a couple of sketches from their proposal that eventually got turned into the preservation plan for the city, which took another 10 years to get funded. But when it did get funded, when this law was finally passed that made the preservation program real, it was a good one. And it provided 2 of 3 ingredients that were necessary to really get the preservation program going. The first is that it provided funding, lots of national funding. That always helps. The funding covered infrastructure improvements to the site, but the other thing the funding did, thank you, the other thing that the funding did was it offered to reimburse people for 50% if they personally invested in restoration. So it gave people some incentive to put their own money in. But that wasn't enough. People still, even with free money, they still didn't do very much. A few people like Pietro Laureano took advantage of the situation, but very few did. Because there wasn't, the site was still shamed. Like his mother said, why would you want to live there? Very few people still wanted to live there because the site was shamed. So, of course, it took Pietro's nomination and Matera's being listed with UNESCO as a World Heritage Site that then started to change public opinion. Then, of course, tourists came. And then, of course, tourists brought money, and that always changes people's opinions. And then once this outside opinions revalidated the Sassi, then the city kind of jumped on board and came together to win the European Capital of Culture title for 2019. Again, we can credit Pietro Laureano for his efforts in that. And of course, some other famous people got involved, and that didn't hurt the image of the Sassi either. We have Renzo Piano was hired to do a proposal for the site. It didn't get realized, but still his name got attached to the site. Mel Gibson shot his Passion of the Christ there, which brought acclaim to Matera, and a bunch of other films were filmed there. And of course, tourists, lots of tourists, have really changed the face of the Sassi. So now Matera has jobs for its youth, and a healthy tourism. The question is, you know, what's the balance? Because if you let tourism get away, it can kill the goose that lays the golden egg. You know, it'll kill the thing that the tourists want to come and see. It can overrun a site. Each year, there are more and more elegant hotels that open in Matera, 4- and 5-star hotels. Here's the bathroom in one hotel here, just a beautiful bathroom and a cave. Here's a beautiful swimming pool and a series of cisterns in another hotel. There are over 300 listings of B&Bs on the Airbnb site in the Sassi. This is just, it's amazing, and the number keeps going up. So what's going to happen in 2019 when tourism is expected to increase enormously? Because the real question is, this title, European City of Culture, requires the residents to be cultural producers, not just B&B owners. But I think that Materans are actually up to the challenge, because musical, theatrical, cinematic, visual arts are all flourishing in the city. The civic life and cultural richness that Italians value so much is really manifest in Matera today. And a really beautiful corollary to this rags to riches story is the fact that even though it was outsiders who first stigmatized the site and outsiders who revalidated the site, it was local initiatives that actually and visionaries, the risk takers, that turned the story around from the story of pain and hardship, the narrative of pain and hardship, to that of art and culture. People like Pietro Laureano and a number of other people who were risk takers who made that happen. This is the whole city that turned out for the announcement of what city would win the European City of Culture. It's just unheard of that Matera, after 100 years of arguing about what to do with the Sassi, they all came together to unanimously go for this, this honor. This is a city that doesn't usually get together and agree on things, so it's really pretty remarkable. And even today, after a year and a half after the city was selected, residents will tell you every single Materan feels a responsibility for improving and embellishing the city in preparation for 2019. The spirit of unity and shared responsibility is having this positive and rejuvenating effect that's healing the old wounds. Dynamism is felt in the streets. The shame that still lingered here even just a few years ago has been eclipsed by pride, and the city's meteoric rise to the pinnacle of cultural fame. Thank you.